Guerras Culturais são a nova Guerra Fria?
Para mediar, a gente chama a diretora de eventos do IEE, Fernanda Ritter. Fernanda, por favor, suba ao palco, uma salva de palmas da Fernanda, gente. Agora vamos montar o time. Melissa Chen. Melissa, how are you? Melissa. Banheiro? Banheiro. Bathroom. Yes, a gente espera ela. Então vamos pular. João Pereira Coutinho, por favor, João. Suba ao palco, uma salva de palmas ao João. João é doutor em Ciência Política e Relações Internacionais, professor do Instituto de Estudos Políticos da Universidade Católica Portuguesa em Lisboa, autor das obras As Ideias Conservadoras, Explicadas a Revolucionários e Reacionários, e também Por que Virei à Direita, entre outras. É colunista da Folha de São Paulo, certo? Com vocês, Stephen Hicks, por favor. Salve de palmas ao Stephen Hicks. Ele é professor de filosofia na Rockford University, diretor executivo do Center for Ethics and Entrepreneurship e Senior Scholar na The Atlas Society. É autor de 6 livros, o mais recente, Liberalism Pro and Con, de 2020, e publicou em revistas acadêmicas como Business Ethics Quarterly, Teaching Philosophy and Review of Metaphysics. Em 2010, ele ganhou o prêmio Excelência em Ensino na Rockford University, recebeu seu bacharelado e mestrado pela Universidade de Guelph, lá em Ontário, no Canadá, e seu PhD em Filosofia pela Indiana University, nos Estados Unidos, certo? Agora, nós estamos nessa expectativa, né? Eu já vi que a Melissa está aí, então galera, me avisem, a gente não quer apressar também, né? Porque é uma coisa importante, né, Fernanda? Posso para ela? E a gente chama. Fechou. Então tá. Fernanda, tudo contigo. Na hora que a Melissa chegar aqui, a gente sobe. Só deixa eu falar o que ela segue, só para eu apresentar a Melissa, né? Deixa eu falar o que ela tem, né? Siga, por favor. Vai lá, gurizada. A Melissa Chen, ela é editora e colaboradora do Spectator, onde seus escritos se concentram na postura da China e nos abusos dos direitos humanos. Ela é cofundadora e diretora administrativa da Ideas Beyond Borders, é Senior Fellow e faz parte do Conselho de Administração da Foundation Against Intolerance and Racism. É uma organização sem fins lucrativos, comprometida com o avanço dos direitos e liberdades civis, com formação em biologia computacional. Trabalhou como pesquisadora no Broad Institute do MIT e, bem na hora, ela chegou. Salve de palmas a Melissa Chen. Fernanda, agora sim, contigo.
Boa tarde. A busca por uma identidade individual é, por si só, uma árdua jornada. Ao ampliarmos essa busca para o nível social, a tarefa torna-se ainda mais complexa. Quando uma sociedade é impactada por mudanças comportamentais e há a percepção da necessidade de reconstrução de uma identidade comum, o resultado pode ser socialmente turbulento. As guerras culturais estão associadas a 3 grandes elementos: etnia, religiosidade e sexualidade. Muito além de temas polêmicos, esses elementos mexem com os costumes das pessoas, trazem conflitos no universo dos valores entre artistas, pensadores e intelectuais, e ameaçam a identidade tradicional de uma nação. Assim como a Guerra Fria, as guerras culturais são um conflito no campo das ideias, mobilizam a sociedade, pautam os debates e cada lado almeja a vitória, com o silêncio do outro. Está difícil achar um espaço comum para que as visões consigam avançar nesse campo. Parece não existir mais pontos convergentes na agenda, estagnando as sociedades e impedindo a evolução da cultura. Será que as guerras culturais vieram para dar o tom do debate da sociedade a partir de agora? É possível encontrar pontos convergentes e positivos em meio à diferença de valores? As guerras culturais são a nova Guerra Fria? E para tratar desse assunto, vai ser uma honra dividir com o palco com esses grandes debatedores. As perguntas, elas podem ser feitas pela nossa plataforma IASO. Ao final do painel, a gente vai ter. A gente inicia, então, com 10 minutos e a palavra inicia contigo, Melissa.
So, this is a very salient topic right now because we are at a time of very enormous political uncertainty and the reorienting and restructuring of the world. The short answer to this question is, are the culture wars the new Cold War? My answer is yes, and in the next few minutes I hope to build the case for you. For almost half a century, after the end of the Second World War, our fundamental understanding of the world, the basic framework that all states held in common, was the Cold War. It established essential processes and prescribed the parameters of engagement with a very stark and brutal clarity. The Cold War engulfed every corner of the world. There was no direct fighting between the two superpowers. It was an ideological contest for global influence. We fought over every piece of land. We supported major regional conflicts known as proxy wars. And it was either us or them, either the Warsaw Pact or NATO. You were either aligned with the US or the USSR. You were either good or evil. And all of this was more important than globalization. But then the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union ushered in a unipolar world where globalization became ascendant. Nations became more economically interdependent. The peace dividend blossomed. We prematurely declared the end of history, that humankind had reached an ideological endpoint, the universalization of liberal democracy as the final form of government. For more than a decade, this seemed to be true. But globalization was not just about economic engagement. It was also a political, social, and moral process. It integrates worldviews, ideas, and cultures, besides just markets. And here is where those who misread Francis Fukuyama's book feel let down in light of what is clearly liberal democracy in retreat today. Many quote his book without the later part of the title. It's not just the end of history, it's the end of history and the last man. It's a reference to Nietzsche. I'm very hesitant to Nietzsche-splain in front of a scholar of Nietzsche here, but the end of history, it was about Francis Fukuyama writes that the typical citizen of a liberal democracy was the last man who, schooled by the founders of modern liberalism, gave up prideful belief in his or her own superior worth in favor of comfortable self-preservation. Doesn't liberal democracy, he asked, leave unfulfilled certain aspects of human personality? And will leaving these unfulfillment lead to these last men to assert themselves in new and unforeseen ways, even to becoming once again first men engaged in bloody prestige battles, this time with modern weapons? In this passage, without actually mentioning it, Fukuyama foreshadows what would become known as the culture wars, a war that is replacing the very defined structure of the Cold War. In the economic conflicts that animated the 20th century politics are displaced by newly emergent moral and social ones: pluralism, free speech, human rights, freedom, and democracy. To complicate matters, the culture war is not just between nations, but within nations. Moral and religious issues such as abortion, gay rights, pornography, multiculturalism, gender ideology, and racial grievances are now just as important indicators of political allegiance than economic issues in America. Virginia's governor race last year was fought on the turf of critical race theory. Implementation of diversity, equity, and inclusion mandates and the elevation of equity as the sine qua non of corporations, universities, and government policies, for example. From speaking with some of you, it seems to me that America is also exporting these cultural issues to Brazil. So far, it doesn't seem so bad here. I don't really see a drive to make Portuguese genderless. Political polarization in the United States is so well documented, and many pundits are now talking about secession and even civil war. Worse, the polarization is not just political, now it's social and cultural. And the popularity of social media and distrust in legacy media further aggravates the divide between the tribes. These fissures in our free societies are exploited by authoritarian rulers, weaponizing cultural differences, religious tensions, and status resentments. And in turn, within the Western nations, foreign policy and geopolitics are viewed through the lens of the culture war. Those in America who uphold social conservatism and nationalism see Vladimir Putin in an almost positive light, aligned with their values as he were. On the other side are Americans who see Russia as an enemy culture for exactly the same reason, for being socially conservative. And so they take the opposite view of the invasion. Moralistic impulses are now beginning to intrude on the execution of a reasonable, responsible, and rational foreign policy. Since COVID and now the Russian invasion, the globalized world is now decoupling. Trade and even travel across political blocs is becoming more economically and politically fraught. Russia has been canceled by companies in the global financial system. Supply chain shocks and moral concerns about forced labor and genocide in China have woken Westerners up to the problems of trading with this nation. These blocs are not driven anymore by economics, but by moral and social forces. The clarity of choice in the previous Cold War is gone and increasingly being recast as a culture war. This is the new structure, and the demarcating lines are not simply between civilizations, but within them. And just like the last Cold War, the new culture war will engulf almost every corner of the world. The new culture will demand that nations and tribes within nations take sides. It will usher in new blocs oriented around different values, and it will bring chaos and instability. It will be us versus them. It will be good versus evil. History, far from ending, is going to restart once again.
João, por favor.
Bom, em primeiro lugar, boa tarde a todos. É um prazer estar aqui em Porto Alegre. I think I'm going to speak in Portuguese, okay? Okay. É um prazer estar aqui, sobretudo para poder partilhar este palco com convidados tão eminentes e, sobretudo, para falar sobre um tema que basicamente tem sido uma espécie de obsessão minha, sobretudo na Folha de São Paulo, nos últimos 2, 3 anos. E se há uma obsessão, significa que alguma coisa de errado se está a passar com as chamadas guerras culturais. Em primeiro lugar, eu sempre fui contra a expressão guerras culturais. Acho uma expressão horrenda relativamente àquilo que se está a passar. E talvez por defeito profissional, académico, aquilo que eu tenho assistido nos últimos anos é uma espécie de combate entre duas concepções de liberalismo que mais cedo ou mais tarde tinham que se enfrentar de uma forma tão violenta como se estão a enfrentar até agora. E isto implica, em primeiro lugar, dizer o que é o liberalismo, para nós percebermos por que motivo as guerras culturais são uma luta entre dois conceitos de liberalismo, sendo que, infelizmente, só um deles é que vai poder sobreviver. O liberalismo começa por ser uma ideologia estruturalmente anti-autoritária, que procura limitar o poder da monarquia, o poder da Igreja, que defende os interesses dos indivíduos, os interesses individuais, e que tem associado, desde os séculos XVI, XVII, XVIII, um conjunto de valores que são valores essenciais para qualquer indivíduo. Um desses valores, evidentemente, é o valor da tolerância. Quando nós olhamos para autores como Spinoza, quando olhamos para autores como John Locke, aquilo que nós vemos é que, antes de uma sensibilidade liberal, a noção de tolerância era bastante precária, pelo simples motivo de que as sociedades partiam do pressuposto de que só podíamos ter sociedades estáveis e em paz quando todos subscrevessem o mesmo dogma. Era uma espécie de condição prévia à existência de uma comunidade. Só é possível existir paz se toda a gente subscrever as mesmas ideias e opiniões. Ora, o que a modernidade liberal fez foi estilhaçar esta concepção de tolerância. O que, no fundo, a modernidade liberal fez foi, basicamente, dizer e defender que não é preciso a existência de um único dogma para que as sociedades possam funcionar. É evidente que, quando nós estamos a olhar para autores como John Locke, o seu conceito de tolerância era bastante limitado. Nós não estamos a falar de um conceito de tolerância como no século XX ou XXI. Mas, apesar disso, nos seus textos, está esta ideia de que, para que uma sociedade seja uma sociedade livre, provavelmente não é possível submeter toda a comunidade a um único princípio, a um único valor ou a uma única conduta de comportamento. O liberalismo vai evoluir ao longo dos séculos XVII, XVIII, atinge o seu apogeu no século XIX, mas o problema é que um conceito estritamente negativo de liberdade, esta ideia de que eu posso atuar sem ser coagido por terceiros e, portanto, eu sou tão mais livre quanto maior for essa esfera onde eu posso funcionar sem ser coagido, vai sofrer uma alteração em finais do século XIX e, curiosamente, o primeiro autor a fazer a transposição entre o liberalismo clássico e o liberalismo moderno é o próprio John Stuart Mill, que é um dos grandes filósofos do pensamento liberal e, sobretudo, destas concepções de tolerância. E, basicamente, o que o novo liberalismo vai fazer é que não basta garantir um espaço onde eu posso agir ou até não agir sem ser coagido por terceiros. É preciso mais do que isso. É preciso dar às pessoas instrumentos para que elas possam ser menos doentes, menos analfabetas, menos pobres, porque a ideia do novo liberalismo é de que é que serve a liberdade se as pessoas não podem exercer essa liberdade do ponto de vista económico ou do ponto de vista do acesso à saúde, do acesso à educação. Ora, o que aconteceu no século XX foi que o liberalismo moderno, ao ir conquistando a ignorância, ao ir conquistando a doença, ao ir conquistando tudo aquilo que, de certa forma, oprimia os homens, começou a desenvolver uma espécie de microguerra, uma espécie de aquilo que Freud designava como o narcisismo das pequenas diferenças, em que, na verdade, tudo pode ser objeto, tudo pode ser um argumento que põe em causa a liberdade e a dignidade pessoais. E, nesse sentido, é curioso como, nas guerras culturais, houve uma radical alteração de dois conceitos, que são conceitos que os progressistas vão transformar radicalmente. O primeiro conceito é o conceito de dano. O conceito de dano. O conceito de dano, nas guerras culturais, é muitas vezes apresentado com um outro nome. É normalmente apresentado com ofensa. Ou seja, tudo aquilo que me ofende, e só Deus sabe como há 1000 coisas que me ofendem todos os dias, tudo aquilo que me ofende é objetivamente um dano. Uma opinião, se me ofende, causa-me um dano. Um artigo que eu leio numa revista ou num jornal, se me ofende, causa-me um dano. E depois existe uma segunda alteração na linguagem. E essa alteração tem a ver com as palavras respeito e tolerância. Aquilo que sustentou as sociedades livres foi o conceito de tolerância, não foi o conceito de respeito. É a ideia de que eu tolero aquilo com que não concordo, não porque eu sou uma boa pessoa, um humanista, mas porque eu entendo que é melhor viver numa sociedade onde, apesar de tudo, as pessoas se toleram mutuamente. Ora, o que acontece com as guerras culturais é que se apagou a palavra tolerância e se substituiu essa palavra por respeito. Eu não tenho apenas que tolerar, eu tenho que respeitar as opiniões que são diferentes das minhas. E isto, evidentemente, é uma enorme violência, sobretudo para a autonomia moral dos indivíduos. Eu não tenho que respeitar coisa nenhuma pelo simples motivo de que aquilo que uma sociedade civilizada exige de mim é que eu seja capaz de tolerar concepções diferentes da minha. E, portanto, eu diria que, para concluir, nós neste momento estamos a assistir a uma luta que é uma luta de morte entre dois conceitos de liberalismo. Um conceito de liberalismo clássico que entende que a ofensa, a tolerância, as diferentes concepções do bem são necessárias para uma sociedade, até por razões que nós depois podemos discutir, que existem razões para manter uma sociedade assim, e aqueles que, pelo contrário, acreditam que para que exista uma verdadeira libertação das pessoas, é preciso apagar dimensões de tolerância, apagar dimensões de ofensa e colocar no seu lugar conceitos muito mais pesados, como os conceitos de dano e de respeito. Obrigado.
Hicks.
All right. Eu falo pouco de português, but I will speak in English and I will move around and I want to show a few pictures. So, do I have my slides up, please? I want to say, in answer to the question of the moment, are the culture wars the new Cold War? I have three answers: no, no, and yes. First way in which it is a no. As Ms. Chen was pointing out, it is much more complicated now. Cold War, it was clear the world was divided into two well thought out, well structured, well strategized ideologies that were in both intellectual culture and military conflict with each other. The cognitive challenge of wrapping our minds around what was at stake and what each side stood for was difficult, but nonetheless it was much more manageable. Now, with the collapse of one form of communism, communism and various forms of leftism have mutated into a number of very virulent but nonetheless strong forms, and we have to understand all of them, but at the same time there is a resurgence on other parts of the political spectrum as well. The liberal-conservative coalition has broken down to a significant extent, but there also are other forms of old-fashioned authoritarianism, neo-Nazism, fascism are making a comeback, there's Islamism, there's that strange hybrid, whatever China is currently, and so on. So the first point is culture wars right now are a global phenomenon, and we have a lot more work as individuals to wrap our minds around just what the landscape is. So it's a lot harder. Second, the answer is no. It's not a Cold War. It was very clear during the Cold War, it was us versus them, and we knew who stood for what. And because of the staggering importance and danger of the external enemy, international communism, well strategized, well funded, well militarized, it enabled us to realize what was important, what was secondary, and we were united by and large in the West, in the liberal democratic West, against this dangerous enemy. With the collapse of that and the ongoing evolution, it's now been a generation. What has happened is, and there I think I would disagree perhaps a little with Professor Zhao, we can have further conversation. The old authoritarian collectivisms did not go away, instead they mutated into a number of new forms, and what we are facing now is a large number of Western intellectuals trained in Western institutions and Western ideas, who are now, of course, global, but they are inside the West and inside the key institutions, and they are fighting the battle against the West, trying to subvert the West from within. So I would argue that the barbarians are inside the gate, and that's a much more stealthy and difficult enemy to face and to understand that you are dealing with. So I'm using strong language here, barbarians. Let me give you some examples of them. All of these are high-placed individuals inside the intellectual world. Of course, I'm an academic, and I don't want to say that every, if I'm a hammer, every problem is a nail, but it did start inside the academy, and the culture wars are an extension of academic battles that have been fought over the last 2 centuries. So I'm going to give you some academics. This is the yes answer. It is the same battle, the Cold War and the Culture War. When you strip it down, the most important issue is a conflict of moral visions. We believe in individualism, in liberalism, in tolerance, in freedom, in extending all of those values equally to all human beings, not only in our own nations, but around the world. So that liberalism is deep all the way down. What we are facing is an enemy committed to a moral code that is collectivized and authoritarian and not afraid to use authoritarian, physicalistic, coercive methods, and in many cases evolved sneaky weapons in the name of that collectivism. They do have a moral code. We have a moral code, and that is the source or the center of the battle. Who has the moral high ground is going to prevail in this debate. So, Professor Frank Lentricchia. We hear a lot about postmodernism in the last generation. Postmodernism is high academic theory, but it's generated a large number of subcultural versions. So we hear about political correctness. That's one application of postmodernism. Identity politics is another variant. Wokeism is another variant, and so on. But it's all part of the same general family tree. We believe, right, in the West, and we are proud of our accomplishments at striving for truth. We think that with science and with technology, we have figured out a lot about the universe and the way human beings ourselves work and how we're going to interact so that we can make the world a better place. And even when we don't know the truth, we think the pursuit of truth is an absolutely moral value. Right? No cheating, no lying, no fudging the data. Let the better arguments prevail. That is an important moral concept that we have internalized in our culture. But the postmoderns do not believe in truth, and they are explicit that they reject the entire idea of truth. So they have bought into a significant amount of skepticism and corrosive relativism, and that's why we hear a lot about those themes. But the implications of this for the culture wars are absolutely important. So this is Professor Lentricchia then saying, well, we're not interested in liberal education anymore. The idea that we're training individuals to think for themselves so they can go out into the world and live self-responsibly and tolerantly and productively and so on. If truth is out, if individual judgment is out, and liberalism is out, then we are going to be playing a brand new game inside the academy. So what he says explicitly is, postmodernism seeks not to find the foundation and conditions of truth. Think about that for a moment. We're not interested in truth. Truth is out. We are interested in exercising power for the purpose of social change. And I'm a professor. I have power. Hundreds of students come into my classes every year, and all of my colleagues have hundreds of students. Our job is to train a new generation of social activists to go out and fight against what we take to be a corrupt, liberal institution, and we're going to subvert it from within. And that's what the second part of this quotation is. My task as a professor is to help students spot, confront, and work against the political horrors of one's time. So by that, what he means is he thinks the entire American, Canadian, Western European, liberal West is a disaster. He's opposed to it, and he's going to train his students with every single problem he can find in those societies to get them angry about that and teach them how to be activists to go out and do whatever it takes to overthrow this existing corrupt society. That's anti-liberalism and a new form of authoritarianism well ensconced in university education. I might think this is only about politics and history and literature and so forth, but they also then will make the same sort of arguments. Science, right, is not a universal method of acquiring truths, and we're not then interested in training people to how to be good with evidence and data and logic and teaching them mathematics and believing that science is a benefactor to humans all over the world, no matter what race or what your gender is. The argument here is a kind of corrosive relativism, that every group has its own way of looking at the world, and what we call science, and we start putting it in quotation marks, is just kind of a white male European way of looking at the world. So it's explicitly anti-scientific, and of course this is a device then, anytime there's a scientific theory that's put out there that they don't happen to like, they've got the ad hominem attack against it. We can just dismiss that. That's a male argument, or that's a European argument, or that's an ethnic argument that we don't particularly like. Human relations. We believe in liberty, respect, tolerance, and the equal application of the laws to all human beings. And the great history of modern liberalism, and I'm concluding the reasonable forms of conservatism, has been a great moral triumph, taking in just a few centuries cultures that took slavery for granted, took the second or third class status of women for granted, divided people up into warring ethnic groups and just hating people because of their differences over ethnicity, and all of the religious wars, and extending this idea of equal liberal rights across the board in the space of really a few short centuries. And we're still working on some of the remaining difficult pockets as well, and we take pride in that accomplishment there. The postmoderns and their offshoots are deeply jaded about that prospect. They don't think we really believe in those things. They think it's a fraud. They believe in an older conflict understanding of human beings, that all of us are divided into various groups. Each group has its own power agenda, and it's just ultimately a nasty power struggle to see who is going to dominate. And of course, sometimes we just use pretty language to dress up what is really an ugly conflict. So the claim here is, against a particularly angry form of postmodern feminism, right? You know this English word yourself, I don't need to read it. But that then is to say men and women, right? They don't really like each other. Men just want certain things from women, and they use their strength more powerfully to get what they want. And this extends to all of the social dynamics here. That basically all men are rapists, and therefore they want to keep women in a secondary form, and hence you're going to get very angry forms of social activism going on. Just one more. All of this inside the academic world then is going to mean we're not just interested in high university debates and so on. We want to remake the world, and the way we remake the world is by changing all of the key institutions. So we're going to obviously go after politics, we go after science, but we also then need to start working on the education of younger people. And the problem this is the postmoderns now face, is that most people who are training to be teachers of those younger people are brought up in a society that they think is terribly corrupt. They believe in science, they believe in equality of men and women, they believe in tolerance and so on. So this is an explicit quotation from the University of Minnesota, one of the leading colleges of education, saying, before students are allowed to graduate from our university as teachers, what they're going to have to demonstrate is that they do not believe in any sort of liberalism of that old-fashioned sort, that they are opposed to that set of values, the idea that young people can pursue their American dream or their Brazilian dream or whatever their dream there is, that we're going to have competition and maybe the better people win in the competition and some sort of rewards for succeeding in the competition. We're going to take it as axiomatic that it's a completely racist society, that's baked into the society, and that you have to feel guilty and ashamed if you happen to be a white person or a person who has any legacy of the history of slavery in your family or even in your broader tradition. Your religion has to be under attack. Your class membership has to be under attack. You need to atone for the sins of your membership. If you're not willing to do that, you can't be a teacher. And only then people who are willing to go down that road and sign, so to speak, the loyalty oath will be qualified to be teachers. This is the exact opposite of the standard liberal arts education that we fought so hard to make standard in Western curriculums over the course of the last 2 centuries. That's a culture war inside the education world. So, the strategy is quite explicit. Right? There's undermine your mind. Human beings survive to the extent that they think well, and they have confidence in the power of their brains to take on big problems and to be able to look at things from all sides, and in some robust cases to do the science and so on to make those difficult judgments. If we can paralyze people's confidence in their ability to think for themselves, then they will be followers. Then they will do what they tell you, and it sets themselves up for another kind of authoritarianism. But also, they're explicit about wanting to paralyze your moral code, to make you feel ashamed of your identity, to make you feel ashamed of your family, your religion, your history, your political attrition. Because people who are ashamed and feel guilty about any of those things are not going to fight back. And that's why I say it is a moral battle that is most important. What we need to do, each of us as individuals, is spend some time on our own individual mountaintops, right, wherever those are, and think seriously about what really matters to us. Identify our core moral principles, our core moral values. Of course, test them against the other people in conversation to make sure we know what we stand for so that we can stand proud against the people who want to undermine our confidence in our own abilities. Now, this is an older form of a battle against authoritarianism that I think most people in the liberal tradition are aware of. This was, of course, Tank Man in Tiananmen Square standing up against a hierarchical authority that wanted to crush down. And it takes a great deal of moral courage to believe in your principles enough to stand up. And so Tank Man, who is still anonymous, is a hero to all of us around the world. That battle is still with us, but I think this one captures a little bit more. This is a man during some rallies by the Nazis back in the 1930s, and everybody is standing up and giving the Nazi salute, and he knows enough in his own mind what he stands for, that this is wrong. He is not going to give the salute. But it's against the pressure of everybody surrounding him, who are his peers. And it's very hard to stand up against peer pressure, conformist pressure of this sort. We need that as well. And that's as we find the postmodern offshoots trickling into more and more aspects of our own culture, that it's not institutions above that are crushing us. It is, in many cases, people in our own social circles. And that's a different kind of moral battle. So I will leave it at that. Thanks for your attention.
Hicks, Melissa e Coutinho, muito obrigada pela fala inicial de vocês. A gente vai passar agora para as perguntas. A primeira pergunta é minha, mas eu lembro a todos que vocês podem se inscrever para as perguntas através da plataforma IASO, tanto quem está aqui na plateia como quem está online. Então, a minha primeira pergunta é: as guerras frias irão dar o tom do debate das sociedades a partir de agora? Como lidar com as divergências para que isso não impeça a evolução da cultura? Coutinho, se puderes começar, por favor. Como lidar com as divergências para que isso não impeça a evolução da cultura?
Olha, em primeiro lugar, relembrando por que motivo a liberdade de expressão é importante. Porque normalmente, quando as pessoas falam sobre a liberdade de expressão, entra-se numa espécie de de círculo fechado. A liberdade de expressão é importante, e porquê é que é importante? Porque é a liberdade de expressão. E, a certa altura, já ninguém sabe muito bem porque é que é importante a liberdade de expressão. Eu ontem, quando cheguei aqui a Porto Alegre, quando cheguei ao hotel, liguei a TV e estava a passar um documentário na Rede Globo. E era a história de um imigrante da Costa do Marfim que tinha chegado a Paris, que queria continuar a viver em Paris, e quando lhe perguntaram, mas porquê que gosta tanto de viver em Paris, a resposta dele, nem de propósito, foi, porque aqui há liberdade de expressão. E quando eu não tenho liberdade de expressão, e esta é a frase dele, ipsis verbis, é como se me estivessem a matar. Esta é a primeira coisa, ou seja, ainda há quem saiba porque é que a liberdade de expressão é importante, sobretudo quando vêm de países ou de outros continentes onde a liberdade de expressão não está assegurada. Mas, em segundo lugar, porque é bastante improvável que uma sociedade possa ter qualquer espécie de evolução moral se não existir liberdade de expressão e uma arena pública bastante robusta. Só é possível nós encontrarmos a verdade, ou pelo menos uma aproximação à verdade, quando o espaço permite que se confrontem diferentes concepções do bem. Imaginem, para tocar num ponto bem problemático, que nos séculos XVIII, séculos XIX, quando se começou a discutir o abolicionismo da escravidão, havia alguém que achava essa discussão politicamente incorreta e impedia que essa discussão pudesse ocorrer. Provavelmente a abolição da escravidão não teria acontecido ou não teria acontecido tão depressa. E, portanto, quando as pessoas querem asfixiar a liberdade de expressão, a primeira pergunta que devem colocar é: o que é que eu posso estar a asfixiar? Que verdade é que eu posso estar a destruir que provavelmente seria importante para a sobrevivência da minha sociedade?
Melissa, do you want to say something about it? Yeah.
The question was about stopping cultural evolution, which, I mean, I think that's a weird, awkward way of phrasing that, because culture does evolve over time. And it's not, I don't think human culture is something that you can freeze in time. It's going to change. Language changes, so culture changes, and social mores changes. There are things that you cannot say today that you could have said maybe 40 years ago, or jokes that might be considered racist today that wasn't 40 years ago. So times do change. Like Professor Zhao, I don't think that freedom of speech or censorship is the way to prevent cultural change. I think the best way to do it is to counter it. At the end of the day, the question is this cultural change in line with human flourishing? Is it adaptive to your society, to your country? And I can think of new intellectual fads today that exist today that are non-optimal for functioning society. When we deny basic science, for example, and if we're denying basic biology, and we are blinded by ideology, I think that's very toxic. And so this is the kind of cultural evolution that we do not want to have. But the only way to counter that is with better ideas. Is when you hear somebody say something, as Professor Hicks was saying, know where you stand, counter it, explain why do you think the way you think, because what is at stake is instability in society at the end of the day.
Do you want to say something about it? No? Ok. A próxima pergunta, aproveitando também o que o professor Hicks comentou sobre as universidades, é como blindar as universidades do discurso raso das guerras culturais? O que fazer para que elas deixem de ser os feudos tribais que se tornaram? Então, as guerras culturais entrando para dentro das universidades e liderando o debate, né? Como a gente pode impedir que isso aconteça? Hicks, Professor Hicks, if you want to start it.
Yeah, well, that's a hard question. I think the universities primarily have to reform themselves. I think any temptation to use political institutions to go in and politically change what can be included in the curricula, what teachers can be hired, is very dangerous, because then that just makes the universities into a political football, and with changes of regime, it's not going to be a long-term solution. So my view is that bad ideas, bad philosophy got us into this mess 2 generations ago. So the only thing in the long term that's going to get us out of it is better ideas and better philosophy. So that there are in fact moral principles, that we do in fact know things, that science is in fact successful, no matter how complicated it gets. That human beings, despite all of their differences, we can show that they are the same and worthy of the same moral rights and principles and so on. So it's going to take better articulation of those arguments inside the academic world against what was a wave of skepticism and moral relativism that went through the academic world 2 generations ago. The cultural phenomena now is a manifestation of that. I also think a lot of it is that young people, they are intelligent, they want to make something of their lives. And they might be going through teenage alienation and angst and so on. But I do think when they go off to university, they are looking for something. And I think much of the change is going to come from the students who realize that they can't just listen to whatever the professors are or just take whatever classes. They need to plug into the grapevine, see which teachers are actually teaching something worth knowing, instead of this jaded, pessimistic, adversarial worldview, and they will abandon the postmodern classes, as I think of it, and they will go off and actually learn something significant. I do think there is a role for reform. Obviously, the professors have to reform themselves, but also administrations need to have more backbone in dealing with the protests that are violent or borderline violent and using threats, instead of bending over backwards and accommodating various kinds of really ugly adversarial student protests as well. And I think also alumni, if you graduated from a university, don't write the checks in support of your university if your university is behaving badly. Send a note to the dean, to the president. So there's lots of ways universities can be reformed without resorting to political imposition.
Melissa, do you want to add something? No? Ok. A próxima pergunta, então, é indo um pouco mais para o campo da política. Então, existe algum espaço para o diálogo quando uma guerra cultural se instala no centro do ambiente político? Ou o ambiente político está em constante embate e dificilmente é possível evoluir no campo das ideias? Coutinho, queres começar?
Olha, eu acho que é cada vez mais difícil estabelecer um diálogo entre 2 trincheiras que se odeiam mutuamente. Em primeiro lugar, porque grande parte da discussão, que muitas vezes é tida, sobretudo por pessoas que apoiam a cultura de cancelamento, etc., é sempre uma linguagem profundamente sentimental. É muito difícil discutir com alguém que, à partida, pensa que está a falar com um monstro moral. E é muito difícil, ou seja, enquanto que nós podemos manter um plano de racionalidade, quando do outro lado existe uma posição que é meramente sentimental, é muito difícil estabelecer essa comunicação. Por outro lado, é preciso lembrar a influência que as redes sociais foram tendo na política contemporânea. Eu não sou crítico das redes sociais, acho que são um instrumento extraordinário, não é isso que está em causa. O que eu acho é que pela primeira vez na história da democracia, a democracia está a lidar com um fenómeno que nem podia passar pela cabeça dos Founding Fathers dos Estados Unidos. O James Madison, ele sabia que existiam fações, ele utiliza a palavra fações, mas ele ao mesmo tempo também sabia que os Estados Unidos eram um país tão grande que se uma fação em Filadélfia, essa fação não poderia contaminar uma fação em New Jersey, a de New Jersey não poderia contaminar uma fação na Pensilvânia, e portanto as fações podiam exercer os seus efeitos nocivos, mas não conseguiriam contaminar o país inteiro. Como é evidente, James Madison não conheceu as redes sociais. Hoje é perfeitamente possível que uma fação de Filadélfia contamine a fação de New Jersey no espaço de 1 segundo. Não sei como é que é possível resolver isto, não sei até se isto tem solução, mas é um dos maiores desafios da democracia liberal no século XXI.
E, Melissa, trazendo também essa questão das... Para você.
Can you repeat the question?
Sim, por favor. Se quiser continuar respondendo a pergunta, por favor.
Oh, can you repeat it though?
Yeah.
Can you repeat?
Yeah, you can answer the question.
Oh yeah, but what is the question?
It's about the political and the cultural war to the political environment.
Whether or not what?
The cultural war
Yeah.
and the political environment.
Oh, okay.
Yes. Ok. A próxima pergunta para o professor Hicks, por favor. Estaria o modelo das guerras religiosas pré-iluminismo retornando em uma configuração de guerra cultural? Essa pergunta é do nosso presidente, Gabriel Torres.
That's a very interesting question. So, our experience with the religious wars of the 1500s and 1600s, how much they illuminate the current cultural wars. And you know, I'm not the first person to observe this, but if you look at the kind of wokest identity politics position, it does seem to function psychologically as a kind of religion, not necessarily metaphysically in the sense of believing in a reality and there's a higher power and so on, but that idea of a faithful commitment and a willing to emotionalistly follow certain values and to believe that your salvation depends on those values, and seeing all of your adversarial enemies as sinners, as deeply guilty, who need to be, in some sense, socially cleansed of those sins before atonement is possible. And that same kind of is God versus Satan moral duality in the culture. So, okay, the psychological buttons seem to be the same as certain kinds of old-fashioned religion. Not to say that all religions have that same kind of psychology, and that makes it very alien. This connects with Professor Zhao's remarks. You know, if you are of an intellectual temperament that says we're going to look at the data, we're going to have some arguments, and I'm going to listen to your criticisms of me, and I'm willing to change my mind in principle and so on. That's psychologically two very different kinds of universe. So then the question suggests maybe we can learn from history, because the religious wars were pretty nasty for over a century, but eventually they did end. You know, that after each country was some variations, and outright persecutions and double standards and burnings of witches and warlocks and various kinds of dissenters. But people at a certain point realized, first in Holland, then a little bit later in England, that we can't go on this way. That if we are genuinely going to have any sort of genuine meaning in our lives, and in this case it's a religious meaning, it can't be imposed. And you can't just be torturing and burning people with whom you disagree. So the more important thing is to have discussion, live and let live. And if you really believe that your position is right, that in the long discussion it should be the one that prevails. So the hope is that we would be able to do that, and hopefully it won't take a century and a half for us to reach that. Now, can I say one more minute's worth of thing, or should I pause at this point? Okay. I do want to say that I am really hopeful, as disastrous as COVID was as a pandemic phenomenon, prior to the pandemic, I think was the height of postmodern social skepticism. Everything is a social construct, and there's just all these different ways, and everything is racism and sexism, and all of these very narrow ways of looking at the world. But as soon as the pandemic strikes, suddenly, basically everyone is a scientist again. And I think that's a very healthy development. Everybody's going online, we're looking at data, we're learning about regressions and how to read statistical curves, and we're considering hypotheses and saying, what are the experiments going to show? And so that's a big cognitive improvement, I think, in 2 years. And I think it's very difficult then for people to say, oh, no, COVID is just a social construct, or it's a sexist plot by white male Europeans, right, or whatever. That just becomes kooky conspiracy theory. So maybe we don't have to get to the nastiness of the religious wars all the way down, that we can start a healthy conversation again.
Melissa, do you want to comment?
I don't know if I'm so optimistic.
I said maybe.
Maybe. I think the problem with when you are motivated by righteousness, you think that your cause is just and righteous, and you are the one with the truth, the moral truth. You can do very heinous things, and we see that during the Crusades. We see that, with Islamic jihadism. We see that kind of mentality taking root now with the people who are fighting against oppression. And they have a very singular worldview. The world is only divided into oppressors and the oppressed, and everybody is in the hierarchy. And when you have such a simple worldview, and you have the trappings of religion, the idea of white privilege, for example, is like original sin. But worse, this new religion does not have forgiveness. There is no way to redeem yourself. You are forever racist if you are born with the wrong skin color or the wrong class. And my worry is that without a path to redemption, without a sense of universalism, these tribal lines will get more and more entrenched, and what will happen is eventually a very religious conflict in nature, because there's no path to forgiveness.
Olha, eu acho esta questão uma questão talvez das mais fundamentais, porque se há uma regra que nós podemos obter da história moderna, é que sempre que há um recuo da religião tradicional, outras formas de religiosidade acabam por tomar o lugar desse vazio. Ou seja, a coisa não fica simplesmente vazia. Existe outra forma de crença, outra forma de religiosidade que ocupa aquele espaço. Vários autores liberais estudaram isso e avisaram sobre isso. O Raymond Aron, o grande autor francês, já falava das religiões seculares. Ele achava que o nazismo e que o comunismo eram espécies de religiões que, de certa forma, sugavam as energias do cristianismo para imitar a estrutura mental do próprio cristianismo. Enfim, não existia o reino de Deus, mas existia o reino do proletariado, ou existia um Reich de 1000 anos. Mas é o mesmo tipo de pensamento messiânico e, portanto, uma das causas que talvez explique por que motivo as guerras culturais estão neste momento à tona, com toda a força, deve-se ao facto de, no Ocidente, a religião ter recuado. É engraçado porque aqui há muitos meses eu perguntava a uma amiga minha americana e perguntava-lhe por que motivo, por exemplo, no derrubo de estátuas, normalmente víamos mais pessoas brancas do que pessoas negras. E ela dizia-me, ela é socióloga, ela dizia-me, porque a população negra ainda vai à igreja. E isto é uma resposta, enfim, que pode ter o seu valor. Ou seja, a descristianização do Ocidente faz com que as pessoas se entreguem a outras formas de religiosidade.
Obrigada. A próxima pergunta vem da plateia e, Melissa, se quiseres começar, a pergunta é da Natália. Durante os debates de hoje, vários participantes se mostram preocupados com o discurso de nós versus eles. Que caminhos vocês apontam para reduzir essa polarização e criar um ambiente em que debates produtivos sejam possíveis? Us between them.
A very big problem now is that people no longer just disagree on politics. It's not just your belief in the tax rate is wrong. Now people assume that you are evil, and so your political opinions are reduced to a moral dimension. And this is one of the reasons why political discourse is so toxic. I like to quote the philosopher Sam Harris, who says that, he's a neuroscientist, but he wrote that when conversation ends, that's when violence begins. And now you have a situation, I don't know how bad it is in Brazil, but in the United States, where people don't even want to have a conversation with somebody that they disagree with. And when they show up on a show or a talk show or a podcast, and the person has, say, more conservative politics, just because you are talking with this person, all the opinions of the other person is now imputed onto you. You have now somehow, just by sharing a stage, now believed every single thing that the other person has believed in, and they will accuse you of, holding the same opinions and being evil. And I think this is one of the main drivers of polarization in the US, is when we are completely cut off and not in constant conversation with the people that we disagree with. And the people that we disagree with don't actually want to have a conversation because they just don't want to share the stage with someone evil. And so we have to change this mindset, this idea that it's great to disagree. We can get on the same stage. I can be a political, economic conservative. I believe in, I don't like universal health care, and the other side likes universal health care. And we have to be able to talk about this and not assume that the other side just wants to be evil.
Yeah, I agree with those remarks. What I wouldn't say as a philosopher, I think the most important issue in us versus them is in cognition theory, how you think the human mind works. And the idea then is, if you have your views and I have my views, if you believe that our minds are competent to access the world, to see the world as it is, to gather data, to categorize the world in various ways, to structure logical arguments, to know some math, then it's not just us versus me versus you, because we can both look at the world and look at the data and check each other's data sets and evidence and logic. And if one of us has been missing out on some data, well, that data is accessible to the other person. If one person has made a mistake in their reasoning, that can be pointed out to the other person. And if you have the attitude that the truth matters and the facts matter, you'll be willing to change your mind. Now, that's why I think the skepticism about the competence of the mind to come to know reality is the deepest poison, because if we're cut off from reality, if nobody can really know their truths, and you happen to believe certain things and I happen to believe certain things, there is no way for us to bridge that gap. All we can do is just consult our subjective feelings, and you're going to consult your different subjective feelings. We have no rational conversational way of resolving that difference. It has to come out in a fight. Now, to go back to the earlier issue about religion, I would say, and this is interesting about de-Christianization or de-religion in the modern world, and this is only, I think, only one aspect of it, but not all religions were created equal, and even Christianity has not been one unified thing. And what happened in the early modern world was a divide between Those within, I'll just stick with the Christianity example since it was the dominant one in Europe, between those who said God has chosen certain people and not chosen various other people, and these people are special and these people are not special. And if you believe that, then you've got us and us versus them, and there is no way to get back that because none of us can control whom God chooses and selects and so forth. All you have then is an us versus them dynamic. Versus on the other side, and Galileo was a great representative of this tradition that said, God created all of us, and this is a religious argument, but he gave us all the power of reason. He gave us senses, he gave us minds, and he wants us to use them to study his word, but also to study the natural world. And so on the basis of that, all people really are equal in their cognitive capacities, and differences over sciences and differences over religion or anything ultimately can be resolved because we have the power of reason. So that cognition theory solved the religion problem, and I think that same sort of cognition theory, pro-evidence, pro-reason, pro-logic, is the only thing that ultimately will solve our current culture wars.
Ok. Uma pergunta a mais? Bom, levando um pouco mais para o lado provocativo nessa pergunta. Então, por algum motivo, esses discursos identitários ou conspiracionistas que inflamam as guerras culturais têm sido aceitos por muitas pessoas. Então, aqui estamos discutindo o tema, né? Vocês acham que é apenas ideologia cega das pessoas que adotam esse discurso, ou tem algum problema que existe de fato e para o qual esses discursos se tornam uma explicação plausível para essas pessoas, ainda que ela seja falsa, né? Ou seja, tem algo que as pessoas estão sofrendo que as faz aceitar essas explicações que elas estão ouvindo? O que poderia ser isso, né? Não sei se algum de vocês gostaria de começar. Hicks?
Could you rephrase the first part of that question?
Sim, por algum motivo, os discursos identitários ou conspiracionistas, eles têm inflamado as guerras culturais e muitas pessoas têm aceitado esses discursos, né? Então, por qual motivo? Por que elas estão aceitando esses discursos?
So is the question why people accept the identity politics understanding of speech?
Yes.
I think I can try take a stab at that. There are a few things, but I think there are moral incentives that exist today that rewards these narratives. So a very good example of a narrative in the United States that was controversial and also inflaming racial tensions was this idea that led to defunding the police in so many cities all across America. And the idea was that the police were hunting and specifically shooting down African Americans at a statistically higher rate. But if you look at the statistics, it doesn't look to be the case. But the media kept parroting this narrative, and it led to real policy consequences. And 2 years later, we are seeing the end of that, the results of that. Crime is spiking in almost every single major urban center in America today. And, and it's very obvious why that is. As to why people, why this is so readily accepted by some activists, it turns out, as the media reported maybe last week, Black Lives Matter, the founders of Black Lives Matter had actually bought houses, $6 million. So there is a lot of grift, a lot of profit to be made from these narratives. And, if you are selling this is a virtuous campaign, I'm campaigning for racism, who doesn't want to be on the right side? It's self-evident. Black Lives Matter is self-evident morally. And if you oppose that, you can be easily cast as racist. So it's very easy to use this narrative for self-profit. And then, there's also the rise of some sort of, there have been incidents of racial hoaxes in America. The Jussie Smollett case. There have been cases where people make up race attacks because they can get attention. And so there are moral incentives because we have now canonized, fetishized victimhood. And so there is an immoral incentive to be a victim if you play your cards right. And as long as those incentives are in place, people will readily latch on to that because it's in their incentive to do so, whether it's financial, whether it's moral, whether it's social. And it feels good to be part of something. It feels good to be part of something bigger than yourself. And this also goes to what Professor was saying about, the lack of religion. When religion recedes, this is another way to feel like you're part of something transcendent and spiritual. So that's my answer.
I think I agree with the most cynical parts of Melissa Chen's remarks there. In my experience among academics and people who are intellectual activists on, say, the racial issues, we'll just take those as an example, I don't think many of them actually believe the strong formulations of the identity politics charges. Rather, they know that rhetorically, those are very useful for building a career, achieving your activist goals, and in some cases, getting funding. So there's a certain amount of grift. Now, the reason for that is that they know there is a significant amount of guilt among majority populations over historical crimes. And they can cash in on the historical guilt in whatever particular agenda they are interested in. Now, why I think this is a cynical that they don't actually believe it, because I do take seriously, very optimistically, the polls where they don't talk directly about racial issues, or they talk about the racial issues embedded in a large number of contexts. And you find out what people really think about all sorts of issues. In nations like Canada and even in the United States, it's very hard to find any actual racists. It's like 96% of the population is basically on board with treating all human beings as individuals, no matter what the color of their skin and so on. So that leads me in the direction of the more cynical interpretation about the use of identity politics. It's a small number of people with a loud megaphone. Now, on this issue of racism, though, I think the guilt is a big problem, and that people, even if they are decent people and they're not racist themselves, they find the guilt argument against them disarming, and they don't know what to do with it. So what I think is absolutely important is to say the battle against racism and the battle against slavery is such a great moral accomplishment, first by Western civilization, that we should be immensely proud of what we did in such a short period of time. You go 300 years ago, nobody in the world had a problem with slavery. I mean, nobody wanted to be a slave. But the idea that there was something morally wrong and disgusting and dehumanizing about slavery, nobody thought that. Everybody thought it was part of the natural order of things, in some cases the God-given order of things, or it's the right of just conquest, I can take you slaves, because everybody believed that. So to go from that environment, and first in England, and then some Western European nations, and then all of the Americas, in a very short period of time, a century, at most 2 centuries, to having the vast majority of people believing that slavery is a disgusting moral stain and we need to exert great effort to get rid of it, and they did so successfully, and to eliminate all of that old-fashioned racial prejudice and get the vast majority of the population tolerant and willing to work with and marry and be friends with people of all races, that is a stunning achievement to be proud of. No guilt.
A última pergunta é da plateia e eu vou endereçar ao senhor, o Sr. Coutinho. Vem da Patrícia Turmina. Sabemos que a política não é racional. Apelar ao sentimentalismo é uma ferramenta que vocês usariam para fortalecer a narrativa ou seria uma estratégia utilitarista demais? Sabemos que a política não é racional. Apelar ao sentimentalismo é uma ferramenta que vocês utilizariam para fortalecer a narrativa?
Bom, que a política nem sempre é racional, já nós sabemos. E que há uma dimensão sentimental, também já sabemos. Agora, o que eu direi é que nos últimos anos aconteceu nas democracias ocidentais um fenómeno em que o discurso emocional, ressentido, de nós contra eles, se instalou na política no Ocidente e qual é a principal consequência disso? A principal consequência é transformar as nossas sociedades em realidades quase tribais, em que um lado é incapaz de funcionar ou de dialogar com o outro. Isto é o contrário do que deve ser a democracia liberal, porque aquilo que define as democracias liberais é o facto de eu gosto do partido A, ele gosta do partido B, ele gosta do partido C. Mas, na noite eleitoral, quando ganha a pessoa A, eu, apesar de tudo, apesar de ficar triste, mas reconheço que a pessoa que ganhou, apesar de tudo, é um de nós. É um cidadão brasileiro ou é um cidadão português, temos mais ou menos a mesma história, a mesma cultura, pensamos de formas diferentes, mas daqui a 4 anos eu tentarei encontrar um candidato melhor. Quando existe uma sociedade que está tribalizada, aquele que ganha não é apenas um adversário político, é um inimigo que põe em causa a minha existência e sobretudo, põe em causa a possibilidade de eu habitar o mesmo espaço que todos os outros. E, portanto, é exatamente por isso que quando nós vemos sociedades que são sociedades tribalizadas, mesmo, por exemplo, no Médio Oriente ou em África, o que é que normalmente acontece? Há uma eleição, alguém vence a eleição, logo a seguir, guerra civil. Porque o que acontece é que o vencedor não é reconhecido pelos outros membros de outras tribos como um legítimo governante daquele país. Se nós trouxermos esta mentalidade tribal para as sociedades democratas ocidentais, talvez elas não possam sobreviver.
Would you like to complement, Anissa? Okay.
On the core question you're raising, which is it's a deep one about the relationship between reason and emotion in politics. You know, I do agree the problem is when emotion is divorced from reason. And in many cases, that is people who have become committed to a certain ideology, and we all want to be committed to an ideology, have kind of a political and a meaningful view or understanding of what the world could be. And I think that's a natural human impulse. But if you get there too quickly, and if you close your mind once you've gotten there to the possibility of changing your mind. And so there I say what you have is a person who has divorced reason from emotion. My philosophical commitments are that reason should work with emotion, and typically in the long term, one's emotions change in accordance with your thinking. So if you are committed to a certain worldview, and the data keeps smacking you in the face and other people who have good logical arguments, and you find yourself, it makes me feel upset, right, to have to change my mind. That's an important moment in terms of your political cognition theory. Am I going to just believe what I want to believe, really just indulge my emotions, or am I going to say, no, maybe I need to change my views on that? So I think, once again, we're back to cognition being perhaps the most important thing in democracy. I spoke at a conference yesterday focused on themes of democracy. If we think some sort of liberal democracy is the right kind of political system, and there can be lots of variations of that, the fundamental commitment there is every individual has the cognitive power to assess the world and come up with pretty good ideas about, say, what the laws should be. And that the way we are going to do this is by having lots of debate and discussion and people's willingness to try this out, vote for that politician, in many cases realize, oops, I made a big mistake, and let's get rid of that guy and try. So that is to say, democracy has to be based on some conception of human beings as rational agents. Now, that's not to be opposed to emotion. We should be passionate about the truth, passionate about the facts, passionate about liberty, passionate about justice, but we have to have good arguments for them.
we keep voting for people based on whether or not we want to grab a beer with them, right? So, less of that.
Professor Hicks, Melissa e professor Coutinho, gostaria de agradecer imensamente a participação de vocês e imensamente por estarem aqui em Porto Alegre conosco no Fórum da Liberdade. Muito obrigada.